Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is one of our Wednesday webinars. And this Wednesday, we're delighted to have Morrison Foerster lead us in for a wonderful Wednesday at noon EST to this Don't Let Lawsuits Derail Your Raise, Managing CPG Claims and Labeling Risk Before Investors Ask. And I will now give it up to Morrison Foerster to introduce themselves. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nira. And hi, everyone. I'm Nina Myers. I am the food and ag strategist at Morrison Foerster. We are delighted to be here. I will just do a little bit of intro housekeeping and really leave this session mostly to my incredible partners and associates. But we did a session similar to this, Claudia and Lena in the team who will introduce themselves at the Well Networks event at Expo West this year, and was really well received. We've, spoken to some startups after the fact who actually implemented some of the discussion or some of the advice around claims and labeling, which always makes us really happy to hear. And so we sort of built this out more into a conversation and webinar around, how labeling claims and decisions that you make there can have really significant legal exposure for your company, but also in terms of your fundraising process. So we really wanted to bring together a conversation around sort of this litigation side and risk management, also with the corporate side and what it means in your fundraising process as a company moving forward, and also kind of what it means for investors in the consumer space. So I will let the partners who are joining me here today kind of intro themselves quickly when they do their own sections. And there'll be lots of ways to connect with us, but definitely do so on LinkedIn if you're interested, and we can do follow-up and sessions after this webinar. But if we move to the next slide, a little bit about Morrison Foerster. We're the leading food and agriculture law firm, and a large part of that group is our kind of leading consumer team. So we work with food, beverage, supplement, beauty, personal care brands, funds, and strategics who invest in those companies. And we're really a partner to our clients throughout their life cycles, from the earliest stages all the way through to exits. And we are kind of a one-stop shop for all their legal needs. So here you'll get to see how our teams kind of work together on the litigation, claims, labeling side, and on like corporate fundraising. We're highly integrated. And we are really kind of a market leader in this field. And so we've just included a little bit about our capabilities, what we do. Happy to dive into it more with any of you following this session. And we've also included on the next slide a bit of a rundown of just a very select few of the clients that we work with across the consumer space. So you'll see a lot of recognizable names and brands here. But again, we'd be happy to dive in more with you following this session. But I will just say we will do Q&A at the end. And please keep in mind that this session is being recorded. So if there's anything sensitive that you want to discuss, please just reach out to us after the session, and we'd love to set up a call. But this session will be recorded and shared with the broader Well Network community. So without delay, let's get into the content, and I will hand it over to my colleagues, Claudia and Lena, to get us started.
To set the agenda for today, we're going to be talking a little bit about product claims, and most of this is going to be focused on food, dietary supplements, beverages. But of course, as Nina said, we have a lot of other clients and who manufacture different types of consumer products. But we're going to focus on this today. So what we have here is a pyramid of risk, starting at slightly lower risk claims for products and going up to higher risk, and again, focused on food. But so in terms of marketing and labeling your product, often you're thinking about what your product is, how you can best discuss the particular attributes, benefits of your product, and you want to make sure that you're making accurate, truthful claims. But what you have to think about beyond that is, while your claims may be truthful, there may be risk nonetheless. And I also say this because as most of you probably know, there are regulations from FDA, regulations from USDA about how you can label claims, but that's not the end of the conversation. again, even if your claims are truthful, even if they totally comply with all the regulations you're aware of, they still might be subject to risk from a legal challenge. We'll talk a little bit more about like where that legal challenge may come from. But starting here with low risk. So low risk romance language, also known as puffery or sales talk, which just could be best, is one, although we'll talk about number one. Number one is something that actually is subject to substantiation, and you need to have some sources to back that up. But it could just be best tasting or great tasting or something very easy like that. FDA approved claims. So if there are some claims that are approved by FDA, like good source of fiber or high in protein, those are very specific regulated claims. Just that claim in and of itself may be lower risk. Risk increases, however, as you step out of what is maybe more sales talk, not really subject to proof, or very specific approved FDA claims, and to claims that are discussing how healthy your product may be overall. So, healthy and wholesome claims like made with real fruit, again, may be totally true, but suggesting that your product is healthy. Going from there, increasing in risk are claims involving light and protein. Both sugar and protein have been trending as far as legal challenges by consumers and others. Again, the idea being that companies, the government wants to make sure consumers are getting accurate and truthful information about the health benefits of a product. And so protein is one where people have been looking for foods with higher protein for some time. So misstating the amount of protein or not providing full information on protein is something that has been subject to a fair amount of litigation. Sugar also stemming from high sugar cereals for children, fruit juice, snacks, things like that. There's been a lot of concern around healthy foods for children and high sugar. And that's not just children, also going up to adults, and concerns about diabetes and other things. So any claims about sugar or something being light or protein definitely has been trending as far as litigation. Then we move up to health halo claims. We'll talk about those a little bit more, but those are general advertising claims, images on product packaging or on websites together that may be suggesting to a consumer that the product is healthier than it really is. So we'll talk a little bit about a lawsuit filed against Poppy for gut health claims based on gut health, gut happy, where the amount of prebiotics was actually not high enough per serving to achieve any of those benefits. And so they were sued and ended up with a very high settlement based on the general claim that they were advertising their drink as being healthier than, or providing a certain amount of fiber that it did not. And then highest risk are the natural claims, which were trending for about 10 years. Natural is a very popular term. It's not defined by FDA. There's a kind of loose policy rule about what natural means. And at the end of the day, it can mean something different to every consumer. And because of that, it is very hard to substantiate that something is natural unless it's literally coming like from the ground. Turning it over to Lena.
Thanks, Claudia. And I feel like we just got really excited to dive into it. And maybe I'll take a step back and just introduce myself and Claudia. We are litigators and we represent all sorts of food, dietary supplement, beverage companies in false advertising litigation, whether that litigation comes from a consumer who's particularly interested in a claim or from a competitor who's watching your claim. So that brings me to the next slide, which is who is paying attention to my claims? And the answer is a lot of folks. So you have plaintiffs' attorneys who are paying attention to claims because they are walking up and down the grocery store aisles all day looking for new and innovative products that might be making certain types of label statements or doing something different. You have consumers who are increasingly talking about the products that they buy and the healthfulness of those products or the wellness attributes of those products online. And then, of course, you have competitors who are paying close attention to the label claims that you are making and how that impacts their business. And then beyond that, there are sort of non-governmental organizations like the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau, which we refer to as NAD. And they pay attention to labeling claims on CPG products as well. and can initiate their own advertising challenges. So lots of folks are looking at your labels. As you could imagine, as relevant to this presentation, your investors are also paying attention to your label claims because potentially high risk statements can sort of change the scope of those conversations. And I will turn it back over to Claudia to talk about natural claims.
Great. So as I alluded to earlier, natural has been a claim that's been trending for some time, although not as popular anymore. But about 10, 12 years ago, a lot of ex-tobacco lawyers decided that they were going to launch the latest attack on food and beverage companies and their product claims. And so suddenly there were a lot of lawsuits being filed, and these are consumer class action lawsuits being filed against all the large food manufacturers, basically claiming that their labels were false and misleading to the extent that they were using terms like natural. And the idea there was that consumers are being deceived about what the ingredients actually were in the product or what the benefits were in the product, and that they were overpaying for the products. And then that was giving rise to this idea that everybody who bought that product over the last 4 years, because that's the statute of limitations under most state consumer protection claims, that they had overpaid and that everybody was entitled to some amount of money back. And so, as you can imagine, at issue in these consumer class actions were millions and millions of dollars based on the sales for those particular products. And these early class action lawsuits that were being filed, mainly in California federal court, were going after multiple products. And so they were pretty high exposure for these companies. And most of them were pretty large manufacturers. But this sort of kicked off heightened scrutiny for food and product labeling overall. And the easiest target, as I mentioned earlier, was natural, because it is definitely debatable as to what natural actually means. Like, is it from the ground? If you boil it, if you process it, like if you freeze it, what kind of product can be natural? If it is potentially grown naturally, but you could also create it synthetically, does that mean it's natural? Is it how it's functioning in the product to preserve something, or add flavor, or just is there? So these were all questions that people were grappling with. There was comment opened by FDA. FDA still has not decided whether it's going to regulate or define natural at all. So anytime in litigation there's an undefined term subject to interpretation, you're going to find attorneys who are ready to seize upon that, file lawsuits saying that consumers think natural is something different than what the manufacturer is advertising. And so here, and you can see this today in certain lawsuits, although maybe not companies using natural, but using like no preservatives, no artificial flavors, kind of around the same idea, like, is this a natural ingredient? But citric acid, maltodextrin, there are a lot of ingredients like that that potentially have dual functions or multiple functions in a product and arguably are not natural because they've somehow been altered since they came from the ground. So this kind of gave way to this whole natural fascination, continued and spun off in lots of different directions. But this was sort of the origins of a lot of the large class action lawsuits that we've seen. And there have been very, very high settlements across the board over the last decade or so relating to food labeling. So the bottom line and takeaway here is that it's important to think about what you're saying on your product labels and on your website, how you're describing your product and the ingredients. And particularly natural and anything kind of related or adjacent to natural is definitely a buzzword that you have to be really careful about how you're using it.
Just to give you a flavor of, I guess, pun intended, on these settlements. So in 2015, Ghirardelli settled a case for $5.25 million challenging all natural statements on 70 plus different products. So sort of across product lines for baking chips and chocolate chips and things like that. And as you can imagine, consumers received some portion of that settlement, and plaintiffs' attorneys received $1.5 million as part of that settlement. And natural claims are not a thing of the past, as Claudia mentioned. So in November 2025, we saw a settlement in another no preservatives, so kind of a variant of natural, lawsuit against a company called Zoa Energy. So in that case, plaintiff alleged that the no preservative statement on the company's energy drinks was deceptive because the drinks contained citric acid, ascorbic acid, sodium citrate, potassium citrate, which plaintiffs alleged were artificially manufactured. And that case settled for $3 million. So the takeaway is as Claudia mentioned, right? Natural statements, no preservative statements require really careful scrutiny, not only of the particular ingredients in a product, but in how those ingredients are processed and manufactured.
We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but two more examples of natural claims that are more recent. The first one is Smart Food on the left, the white cheddar popcorn. And as you can see in the red box, it says no artificial colors or flavors, no artificial preservatives. So again, this is one of the kind of natural adjacent claims that we've been discussing, definitely on the higher risk side of things. And in this particular case, a class action lawsuit was filed against Smart Food in the Northern District of Illinois, basically arguing that these claims were deceptive because the product contains maltodextrin, which is a highly processed starch derivative that's created through a particular process, a hydrolysis process. And so plaintiffs are claiming that because it has that ingredient, no artificial is false and misleading. And also that the ingredient is operating as a flavoring agent and a preservative, which also arguably is preserving the product. So then the no artificial preservatives claim is arguably false and misleading. And again, here it comes down to what a reasonable consumer might think that these claims mean, and then how this ingredient is functioning. So it's a mix of consumer deception and a little bit of mix of science that will then require retaining experts and doing consumer surveys. And so there's really no easy way to dispose of a case like this. And as we were talking about earlier, the claim here of damages is that everybody who bought Smart Food over the last 4 years and any single Smart Food flavor that has this claim, they're all subject to get back some amount of money based on the purchase price. Lena, turning it over to you for Chobani.
Yes, the Chobani case is sort of similar, a similar theory. So, in this lawsuit, which was filed in 2024, plaintiffs challenged the only natural ingredients statement on the front label of Chobani's zero sugar Greek yogurt line. And the basis of that allegation was that the yogurt contained a number of ingredients like stevia leaf extract, monk fruit extract, citric acid, which plaintiffs alleged were ingredients that underwent significant industrial extraction and fermentation processes, and so therefore were not natural. Um, Chobani fought this lawsuit. It had been filed in state court. They removed it to federal court, filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that consumers wouldn't be misled by these statements. But ultimately, the court held that plaintiffs had alleged enough to state a claim as to the stevia leaf extract, monk fruit extract, and citric acid. Um, so plaintiffs had, stated a claim sufficient to proceed to discovery about how reasonable consumers would understand only natural ingredients. And shortly after that decision, the parties went ahead and resolved this lawsuit on a private basis. So we don't know how much Chobani paid, if at all, to resolve this, but it is no longer on the docket.
So we're going to talk a little bit about health halo claims, which is something that I mentioned earlier when we were looking at the risk pyramid. So as you can see, most companies, when they're looking to label their products, hopefully, if they have counsel or otherwise, have some sense that product labeling, product advertising on food is important, and they want to make sure that they are trying to steer away from riskier claims that can lead to legal challenges. And so a company may think, okay, we're going to stay away from natural. We're looking at our ingredients. Maybe we can't support no preservatives, no artificial flavors. We're going to focus on something else. We're going to focus on attributes that we think differentiate our product and where we think, for example, maybe we have lower sugar or maybe we have real fruit or whatever it may be. And so companies may try to figure out with marketing some creative ways to be able to advertise their product as providing some sort of health benefit, but steering away from something very specific. And so health halo is a term that's been given to products where they are trying to suggest that their product is healthy, using images. So Poppy is an example we'll talk about in a little bit, but that was one that was a really popular, non-soda option or alternative to more conventional soda, because the idea was, oh, you drink a Poppy and it's healthier than drinking a Sprite, let's say. It has less sugar. And then on top of that, they were advertising that it had some amount of fiber in the product. And so people thought, oh, gut healthy, gut happy. This sounds great. Heart healthy. I'm going to drink a Poppy and it's going to be like good for me. And the issue with the health Kayla claims is many companies may think, well, we're not really saying anything specific. We're just suggesting something about the health attributes of our product. But that doesn't mean that you're not subject to potential risk there. And the risk really stems from the idea that, like, by focusing on one attribute or one particular ingredient, maybe you're not acknowledging the fact that, like, there is a higher amount of sugar or how many servings you have to consume to get to that, to actually have something happen to your gut. And so the idea here is that a company's potentially advertising its product as being healthier than a consumer may think it is. What does a consumer think is, again, something that you have to ask consumers. And so it just turns into a factual issue that makes it really hard sometimes to dispose of these cases. And so we've had a number of clients who've been really surprised where they had romance language on the back of their product saying, eat our cereal and start your day on a healthy path, or something like that, where you think, okay, what does that even really mean? And they were sued for the idea that, oh, well, if you're saying that you can eat the cereal and it's a start to a healthy day or a productive day or a great day or whatever it may be, people are going to assume that the product only has, X amount of sugar per serving. How you connect the dots from something kind of vague to the amount of sugar in the product is something that is hard to understand. Plus, if you have a nutrition facts panel that states the amount of sugar in their product, again, hard to understand how a consumer could be deceived by that. That's an example of a case that actually we got dismissed on emotion, but it just goes to show that really any sort of statement about your product being healthy or focusing on some ingredient being healthy or good for you is going to carry some amount of risk. And so we'll talk in a minute about two of the Poppy settlement and the Kellogg settlement. But it really is important to vet the claims you're making. And again, sometimes you think if you take something out of context, just an image of something, a fruit, maybe that's okay. But when you look at all of the product labeling together or the website together, you have to think about the comprehensive message that's being conveyed.
Yeah, and there have been huge settlements in the space, as Claudia mentioned. So Kellogg, of course, like a gigantic brand, in 2021 agreed to a $13 million settlement over claims on certain cereals that the claims were heart healthy or lightly sweetened. And that case, just for context, had been filed in 2016. Um, so Kellogg had litigated that case for years and years and years, and that's something that we often see among our clients who are embroiled in litigation. There's not only the risk of large settlements, but the risk of kind of being bogged down in litigation that can take quite a bit of time. So, in the Gatorade protein bar case, plaintiffs allege that PepsiCo, which owns Gatorade, had falsely advertised these Gatorade protein bars as healthy when their high sugar content rendered them, in plaintiffs' eyes, unhealthy, regardless of whether or not the protein bars contained protein. So, plaintiffs specifically challenged a couple of claims on the labels of the bars. One of those claims was the 20 grams protein per bar claim that's on the front, and another statement was protein to help muscles rebuild on the sort of top portion of the label. And plaintiffs had a really interesting theory. Their theory was that because the bars have high levels of, in plaintiff's eyes, both total sugar and added sugar, the statements regarding protein, the heavy advertising into protein, was deceptive. Now, they didn't argue that the bars somehow had less than 20 grams of protein. Everyone seemed to be aligned that the protein content was correct, but the theory was just that by advertising protein so heavily, plaintiffs had misled consumers into believing that the bars were more healthy than they really were. Gatorade fought this case, but the court refused to toss the case at the pleading stage, and then the parties resolved the matter on a private, confidential basis after that.
And one thing just to add here and why it's so important. So a lot of these cases we've been discussing are relate to larger manufacturers, but Poppy is an example where they were basically ready to go through with an acquisition, and they were being acquired by Pepsi. And so it's just important to remember that trying to steer clear of riskier claims, trying to make sure you have substantiation to back up your claims is important for companies that maybe are smaller and are looking potentially to get acquired. And so it's not the case that necessarily that plaintiffs' counsel goes after only large companies that they think have deep pockets. It sometimes does happen, and we see this often, that smaller companies are also targeted. So really any size company is fair game. And the idea here is really protecting your brand, showing a potential, if you are looking for acquisition, showing a company that you're mature enough to have gone through the label review process, you understand the risks, and that you've paid attention to that. That's something that just is providing value in general.
Companies often come to us and they say, well, we have um, a FDA consultant. We've verified that our labels comply with FDA requirements. And the reality is that compliance with FDA's regulations is the floor. It's not the ceiling. And so we often see litigation even where a product is arguably compliant with FDA regulations. So light is one of those types of cases. FDA has regulations regarding light claims, and light claims have to be, at least 50% less in calories, in fat, and 30% less in calories. Um, but litigants have challenged even compliant light statements on packaging, arguing that the statements led them to believe that products were low in sugar or calories. So one such lawsuit was filed against Arizona for their light Arnold Palmer beverage, with the theory being that consumers believed that light on the label meant that the product was low in sugar, when in reality, plaintiff alleged that the beverage contained almost as many calories and more sugar than a can of soda. Takeaway here is that compliance with FDA regulations is not the end of the analysis, it's often just the beginning.
Just touching briefly on ultra processed foods. What are ultra processed foods is a good question. There's no uniform definition. In our current MAHA movement, there's been a lot of focus on ultra processed foods, particularly as it relates to children, school lunches, etc. And so this is important to know because the government has actually gotten involved, or at least local government. So the San Francisco city attorney filed a civil enforcement action last year against 11 major food and beverage companies over designing, marketing of ultra processed foods, which they claim contain highly processed additives or ingredients that are unhealthy for children and can lead to diseases like diabetes. And so this definitely is another example of how using certain terms or using certain ingredients can raise potential issues. But here, and this you can see a picture of like the mac and cheese, that they're not really focusing on a natural claim or anything like that. But the idea is you're just marketing this as a meal for children. And that the product is somehow deceptively unhealthy. So even if you look at the ingredients panel, even if you look at the nutrition facts panel, none of that is going to negate the fact that this product has what some people are calling ultra processed foods. The law is still shaking out over what ultra processed foods really mean. There is a certification program now that some companies are using, the non-ultra processed foods certification. And while third-party certifications can be helpful to show that you comply with that certification, it doesn't mean that consumers totally understand what that certification means. It doesn't mean that like necessarily there is no risk if you have a certification. So just wanted to flag that. However, it is good to take a look at potential third-party certifications to assist with things like that. But like natural ultra-processed foods, this idea that you can have sort of these ingredients that are highly processed or somehow chemically derived is something that continues to create legal risk. And again, marketing to children also creating legal risk.
And our last food trend is on plant-based foods and protein. So protein is everywhere. It has been everywhere for a couple of years. And where we often see a trend in the CPG market, we see a trend in litigation follow shortly thereafter. So we're seeing plaintiffs' counsel increasingly bringing claims against especially plant-based food manufacturers, alleging that the products that they're selling are not actually as high in protein as they claim to be, and that the labels obscure the protein quality of the products. So the thesis here really is that, as I'm sure you know, different plant-based protein sources um, are of different quality. Some are more digestible by the human body and some are less. And FDA has technical regulations for how to incorporate protein quality into the calculation of the percent daily value of protein in the nutrition facts panel. What plaintiffs have been alleging in these series of lawsuits filed against companies that manufacture things from plant-based burgers to cereals to granolas is that manufacturers have either not calculated the percent daily value for protein at all in the nutrition facts panel, even if they're required to do so, or have done that calculation for some reason incorrectly, in a way that makes consumers believe that their protein that they are receiving is more digestible than it really is. And we've seen some quite large settlements in this space. So one such example was a lawsuit filed in 2023 against Beyond, alleging that they overstated the protein content and the protein quality in their products by omitting the percent daily value for protein. That case resolved on a class-wide basis in 2024 for $7.5 million. And since that time, we're continuing to see these protein lawsuits filed at a fairly steady rate. So the practical takeaways is that plaintiffs' firms are paying more attention to protein than ever before, especially for plant-based food products. And so if you're making a protein claim on a particular product, your substantiation should be pretty buttoned up and you should be conceptualizing how these cases might apply to your particular product.
There's no way to completely eliminate risk. It's not possible. You will get a legal challenge at some point if you are on the market. You can definitely call us and we can help figure out what you can and can't say. But the idea is no matter what stage your company's at, there is value and there is benefit to vetting your claims, taking a look at them, have someone review them, particularly legal counsel, which helps your company at that time hopefully avoid lawsuits and challenges. Or if you're looking to be acquired, same thing. So just wanted to close that out with that. Thanks so much. And Zainab?
Hi, everyone. I'm Zainab. I'm a partner in our emerging companies and venture capital group, focusing on consumer. Our group works with fast-growing companies, venture capital funds, private equity funds, really at all stages of growth across financings, acquisitions, strategic transactions. And, we see over 300 deals a year. So, doing a lot in this space. Before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to the Well Network for having us, and thank you guys all for joining. I think a lot of what Claudia and Lena were saying resonates a lot with the brands we work with, particularly the way that they are growing and scaling their businesses. I think it's become more relevant than it was previously for smaller companies and fast-growing businesses. So really just wanted to spend some time tying, labeling claims compliance with a fundraise process. Whether it's, your first round or, your 2, 3 rounds in. So I think first just wanted to kind of set the tone that, whenever brands or companies receive term sheets from interested investors, 99% of the time, the term sheets are non-binding and subject to diligence.
Even at the earliest stages, diligence around, regulatory matters, labeling, product claims, anything like that is somewhat, post term sheet. So once you've sort of agreed to the high level deal terms and governance and what you're going to give your investors. So it surfaces much later in the process once, the company and the investors are underway, looking to do a deal together. And, for consumer brands in particular, diligence goes beyond just, cap table, how much of the business the investor is going to own, whether the company owns its IP, the management team. It goes beyond that. It really goes into, okay, what is making your product unique? How are you scaling your brand? Does your growth and marketing strategy jive with, the way the investor's underwriting its investment? What do they see as an exit for the company? What are the prospective strategics or private equity funds that will be interested in acquiring the company? And so there's a lot of projection that is looking at future growth and scalability. And that's where, product claims and labeling become a key diligence area for consumer brands. So, it depending on your growth, depending on what kind of product you have, the category you are kind of exploring, obviously that will mean different things for a company. And at various different stage, the budgets will be different for a fast-growing company. Investors understand that. How they want to kind of view their investment is, operational capital, but then also a portion set aside for growth capital. And product claims, labeling, compliance sits within that growth category. And so they really want to see, have the companies sort of run through process. Do they have substantiation? Can they support efficacy claims? And how would that sort of help the company grow in a sustainable way and maximize the use of capital? And so the investors really want to view branded products opportunistically rather than in like a risk mitigation mindset. And that's how they're going into diligence. That also very much sort of reflects the way that management is viewing, how they are scaling. Like, are they really addressing these issues? Are they, focusing on risk mitigation? Really giving investors the confidence they need. I think one of the important things, to focus on is what happens if, there is a finding during diligence that, oh, like there is a claim from competitor or there are regulatory inquiries, like what happens? In some instances, for example, we worked on a deal where it was a very hot product. It was a competitive process. The company was getting fantastic deal terms, economically, light touch on governance. But during the course of the fundraise, there was a claim by a competitor, which really paused the process. It paused the process because the investors were like, oh, okay, we need our regulatory counsel to provide an opinion on this. Like, does this claim have merit? How much of our capital is going to go into fighting this litigation? We are sort of underwriting this for a certain type of growth. Are we just going to be spending all our resources on this? And if the company can't back up efficacy claims, then what does that mean for an exit and growth purposes? Thankfully for this company, they had done a ton of work to substantiate their efficacy claims and deal with any of these sort of claims from competitors or otherwise. They provided all the data that, investor counsel, and we were representing the investor in this instance, that was needed. And honestly, the transaction went back on track. The deal terms remained the same. There's obviously a lot of these sort of claims in lawsuits that happen as part of the market and the practice, but knowing that you have what you need to just deal with it and proceed with the business as is the comfort the investors need. They don't need a squeaky clean situation. So that's one way that this comes up during a fundraise. The other one is, related to it may not be an issue that, pauses the deal or derails the whole deal, but changes some of the control provisions the investors have. If there is a consumer branded product, investors are coming in, they are ready to support management in the way they want to grow and run the company, making use of the capital. However, in one of the financings we worked with recently, very cool skincare company, doing a lot of great work, built a lot of fan following around its brand. And while we were doing diligence, the investors saw that their trademark strategy was a little bit flawed. They'd entered into a coexistence agreement with a potentially competitive large strategic, could really derail growth trajectory. And investors just started doubting the way that management is running certain things, and asked for, based on this, more oversight and more controls, and potentially a discussion around valuation if they couldn't really fully exploit a certain market or grow fully in a different market based on this trademark strategy, which at the time that you're sort of maybe entering into this and you have a large strategic here, you think you're doing your best, but it may not be the right move. So I think, like, really digging in, not moving too fast. When you are seeking advice from counsel or otherwise, making sure that they are as aligned with your business plans and growth trajectory as what is being contemplated and pitched to investors. So I think, yeah, being proactive is critical. I think, with that, I wanted to kind of just summarize that, there is, inherent part of a consumer branded business that involves claims, labeling, compliance, brand protection. And given that the venture model has sort of completely permeated the CPG, consumer, food, bev, personal health space, there is a very fast moving trajectory towards growth and exit that wasn't previously part of the consumer model, even 10 years ago. And so, with that, I think while the companies are well capitalized, moving fast, a lot of what Claudia and Lena said around, even small businesses are equally targeted, whether it's plaintiffs or governmental bodies. They know that you're funded sometimes. They know who are your investors on the cap table. They understand what the growth might look like and how you're setting yourself up for an acquisition. And so all of these things, being proactive is critical and very, therefore, important to a fundraising cycle.
If there's anyone who wants to jump in, pop a question in the chat, please do so now. We have a few minutes left. Again, we are happy to take any questions offline as well, given this is a recorded and shared session. So, feel free to reach out directly to any of us or all of us, whatever makes the most sense. Nira or Brian, any thoughts from you all on kind of Q&A?
Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you. This was an extremely helpful, at least for me, informative session. There is a question in the Q&A from Peter Derail. He is asking that many startups are able to fly. He's presuming that many startups are able to fly under the radar or assume higher levels of risk because they're still emerging. But at what point, generally speaking, do companies need to really start paying attention on the legal front? For example, 5 million ARR, 1,000 plus stores. He's curious to see examples of startups sub 10 million revenues who are getting sued. And he's presuming they either don't happen very often or settle, or is it near acquisition when you need to start paying attention?
I can start with that. I think you should start paying attention from the beginning. But really, it's as soon as you're hitting market. So as soon as you're advertising things, you have a website, consumers have access to this information and have the ability to buy your product. As soon as you are out there in the marketplace, in retail, there is going to inevitably be some amount of risk. We have a lot of clients who are small, so below the numbers that you mentioned, who get demand letters. You are correct that most of the time those matters resolve early on in an individual settlement because those companies are small and often can't afford to pay litigation. And also, there is the potential negative PR that comes with a formal lawsuit. And so, for the most part, the smaller companies are resolving these. But the thing is you resolve one and maybe it's not that much money to make it go away, but then you get another one and another one and another one. And so at some point, it is really important to do the vetting of the labels to try to minimize risk so that you're not getting as many of those letters. And then obviously, of course, as you're heading into acquisition mode and you know that there's going to be scrutiny as far as like how many letters have you received? Did you settle them? What did you do? All of that vetting process is not something that can happen overnight because it can go to what you call your product. What are the core messages, the advertising, websites, social media? And so it's not something you can really scrub overnight. And gathering up the substantiation. And so really it's so much easier and likely you're going to be paying out less money if you do that work upfront before your product launches into market. That's just my litigation perspective, but happy to turn it over to others for additional input.
Yeah, I think the risk really magnifies if you're in retail at all. Like if you're at a Sprouts or a Target, the chance of litigation is um, not de minimis, right? When you have that many eyes on the product, somebody is going to come up with a theory. And then, we even have clients who are mostly selling online and they're still receiving demand letters. So there's really no bright line rule as to amount of revenue that can make a company a target.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think from my perspective, right, we see companies at the earliest stages. A lot depends on what your product is, which category it falls into, what you're putting on your label, how you're marketing that, where are you selling, who's your customer. So all that aside, also if raising capital before you eventually exit is part of your growth strategy, it's going to come up each and every time you fundraise. So even before you are talking to a buyer or, setting yourself up for an eventual sale, it'll be a conversation and a potential hindrance to how you raise funding to get there each and every time. And every investor has a different risk appetite. And so, having all of this squared away from the very beginning, while it may feel like, you don't have the resources, is a very good use of capital, because it is eventually going to save many, many dollars down the line.
Great. And then Judy Kim actually has two questions. Let's start with the first one. For food manufacturers that use traditional or heritage production methods like fermentation or alkaline processing, how should they think about natural claim risk when the process itself is centuries old but not widely understood by consumers?
So there is risk. Alkalized cocoa was trending for a very long time. The idea being that if you are not using a natural alkali like baking soda, that your product, then the chocolate was not natural. So there was a lawsuit filed against Ben and Jerry's for that. And then there was a lot of discovery into suppliers and the way suppliers use alkali in chocolate products. So definitely there is risk anytime you are, and again, with depending on what the process is, are you using only like a baking soda or using a potential synthetic alkali? But in general, and fermentation comes up too. If you can explain to the consumer what the process is, whether it's on the product label and then also backed up by things you may be seeing on your website, which they may also see. And then, of course, it depends on how you're advertising the product, mainly social media, online, or is it mainly purchased solely in retail? But in any case, the idea being if you're explaining to the consumer what your process is, what the ingredients are, and it's clear from the front of the label, it's clear when you turn the label over to look at the ingredients, that is probably the best way you can minimize risk is really giving that information, the material information to the consumer so they can understand what the process is. But yes, it's a risk because anytime there's any kind of process and you can argue about whether that process renders something natural, unnatural, natural again is a buzzword where there will always be risk.
Okay. And if a food manufacturer supplies product to restaurants or retailers who then make their own label claims about that product, does the manufacturer carry any downstream litigation exposure for those claims?
That's a mixed question. It really depends on, well, there's a couple things. Uh, I mean, do you have an agreement with that restaurant, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever entity they may be, about what they can say about your product? I'd be very wary of letting a third party make claims about the product that the company has not vetted. Because chances are, if someone is looking at that and they see it, the company is going to get sued and the restaurant's going to get sued. They're both going to get sued. And then there's going to be a fight about who had ultimate sign off on those claims. Even if the manufacturing company was partially involved in those claims or knew those claims existed, they are likely going to be on the hook for those claims. Lena, any additional thoughts on the restaurant aspect?
Yeah, I mean, for retailers, if you're providing a product to a retailer and selling it as like a private label product, we often see retailers requiring indemnification agreements from manufacturers. So even if the product doesn't have, your company's name on it, contractually, there is downstream liability. And we often handle those types of cases.
Okay, and Paul Rothbein, I know we this was covered a bit in the slides before, but he's wondering, are there any concerns with new labeling for plant-based meats? For example, some places prevent using meat and must use plant-based food.
Lena, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, there's like a patchwork of state regulations on these issues. So yes, the short answer is there are concerns about this, and largely depends on what the product is, how consumers understand the product, and where you are selling.
And then I actually have a question regarding like functional beverages. What are the most significant recent enforcement or litigation trends affecting that?
It depends on what the functional ingredients are. So there's a fair number of companies making claims about um, focus, energy, calming effect, kind of in the nootropic space. And there hasn't been a whole lot of litigation yet, but what we have started to see is interest from the NAD. Which is the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. Lena mentioned NAD earlier when we looked at the slide on like who's paying attention to your claims. They refer up to the FTC. And so we have started to see what I would call sort of quasi-governmental interest in what functional ingredients are and some of the claims that are being made with regard to functional ingredients. That's what I can think of off the top of my head. I feel like we may have seen some threatened litigation potentially over functional ingredients, but what I don't think we've seen quite yet is a full-on consumer class action litigation trend. But with that, Lena, anything to add to that?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that the legal market is catching up to CPG in terms of functional foods, but it's certainly something that we see on the horizon, especially where our clients are making claims relating to calm, energy, and focus.
Okay, and to round this off, like what documentation should brands maintain to support claims if challenged by regulators or plaintiffs' attorneys?
It's really helpful if you have a dossier of some kind where you've collected all of the studies that you have that support the specific claims that you're making with the ingredients and the quantities of the specific amounts, so that it correlates and you have that ready to go. Ideally, obviously, the double-blinded human clinical trial type studies of your specific product are going to be the gold standard. That's what's set forth in the FTC guidelines. But that's not necessary to substantiate claims. But again, the idea just being have everything collected for every single claim so you know what you're using to support your claim at the right quantities. Lena, anything to add there?
No, I think that's right. And that's for every claim, right? So regardless of whether you're making a functional claim, that's true for organic, for sustainably sourced, for anything that could be subject to challenge. Having really organized paperwork is going to go a long way.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time at the moment, but thank you, all of you, Nina, Lena, Claudia, Zainab, for such an informative, wonderful webinar.